Welcome to this New America virtual event. It's my pleasure to introduce Brian Barber, who's going to be talking about his new book, No Way But Forward. He will talk about some of the big stories and themes of the book. Brian was a New America Fellow in 2016. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Tennessee. He's the author of other books, particularly about adolescence, and he's been following three particular Gazans for the past 3 decades, which is the subject of his book. So I'll hand it over to Brian, and if you have questions, put them in the Slido box, and I'll be looking at that as we go along. And if you want to buy the book, you can do that on screen during this event.
So thank you, Peter. It's good to see you. This event has been a long time in coming. I think we first discussed it in your offices on L Street in 2014. So let me first thank you and also David and Emily and the rest of the comms team at New America for putting this on. And for all of those who have taken time out of their day or evenings to listen. I appreciate that very much, and I guarantee that my family who are the center of this book appreciate it even more. So I'll just start with some brief comments about the book in general and why I hope that it will be widely read. On my shelf next to me, I have nearly 3 dozen books in English on Gaza. Most of them are on history or economy or politics. No Way But Forward differs in that it is focused intently on individuals and their families, and how one lives under a military occupation and makes life work in very difficult and increasingly difficult circumstances. You'll not just hear stories of crisis and trauma, but you'll hear everyday stories that are very familiar to all humans about the schooling and education and forming families, raising children. You'll hear stories about infertility and the stigma attached to it. You'll read stories about the tragic death of a mother from cancer. Only to be awakened occasionally to realize that this is occurring, this familiar drama, family drama is occurring in that little bitty part of the world that has been so devastated for the last 50 years. So a little bit about how I got involved in this. Back in 1994, I was a young assistant professor in the sociology department at BYU and was invited to join a team of sociologists who wanted to study the Palestinian family. The reason being that the 6-year-long intifada or uprising that brought the Palestinian issue to the global stage had just ended. And there were concerns from various parts about how well the family endured and whether the authority structure is still in place since young people went out and exercised unusual autonomy in demonstrating and throwing stones and the like. So we were ambitious. We did a massive study of Palestinian families in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and eventually Gaza, each with a mother, father, and an adolescent child. And we, produced valuable research that we published in major academic and health and medical journals over the decades. There were 2 factors that kept me, that led me to embrace the project fully and led me to stay on and eventually lead it and keep it going for these 3 decades. Both had to do with realities on the ground that I confronted that so drastically defied the expectations and stereotypes that I had. The first is common to most anyone who's gone to Palestine, and that is the radical contrast between what we bring with us about a people who are angry and vengeful and are victims, and we see instead people who are uniformly friendly, polite, respectful, engaging, interested about us and others, and utterly devoted to raising their families and achieving as much education for their children and living hopefully a life of freedom and self-determination. Okay, the second one was a professional one. I was trained in social and psychiatric science, but the concept of resilience refers only to a very small minority of humans who somehow magically make it through the traumas that disrupt and even devastate the rest of us. And that even one exposure to a traumatic event would be enough to cause serious disruption in an individual. Our data, which was good, incredible, and large, made it very clear that this generation of young people who had just been through those 6 years of often daily conflict, out on the streets demonstrating, throwing stones at huge Israeli tanks. Those of us old enough can remember those video clips every night on the news, and who were very severely treated during that 6-year period. Our data show that fully a quarter of the male youth population was in prison. Large minorities of females and large majorities of males were hit or kicked or shot at with bullets and humiliated in various ways. It's a rough period of time. Yet they proved to be doing remarkably well. High levels of self-esteem, self-confidence, committed to their education, performing well in school, and hopeful about a better future for their people and family. Okay, so that was a revolutionary finding for me. It contradicted everything I had understood about human psychology and functioning. And so, although our data were very broad and good, they didn't tell us the reason how that could have happened. And so I understood quickly that I needed to understand the culture much better. And I decided that I would dive in as deeply as possible and chose refugee camps in Gaza as the deepest dive, and began living for long periods with families in or near refugee camps. And that was in 1996 when I first went, and then virtually every year since. I have been back for weeks or months per year until Corona hit. And then I was finally able to get a permit from the Israeli military to re-enter Gaza by October 2023, set my entry date at October 15th, and needless to say, I canceled that trip. So it's just a little bit about my protagonists, which I'll call characters off and on. On paper, Hussam and Salman and Khalil are virtually identical, relatively the same age, born in refugee camps in Gaza, have continued to live in Gaza ever since, with some years abroad for two of them for graduate education. They have all married and have between 3 and 5 children, and they've been fortunate enough to find meaningful employment all of their lives. They're kind of, shall we say, maybe the middle professional class of Gaza. Yet, and of course, they spent their teenage years during that Intifada and have endured, like everyone in Gaza, the successive bombings and economic siege and all of the constraints that have been placed on Gaza progressively ever since throughout their lives. Yet they're different personalities. Haman, easygoing, often boisterous, committed. I call him the social man in the book, the social man of the group, because the essence of his life are his personal relationships, not just with family, which of course applies to all Palestinian families, but his devotion to his students and teaches, and unusually he was given the privilege or burden of being deputized by his father, Fuad, who was and still is the Mukhtar of the family, for tribal chief, for mayor, and Fuad, and now man, or since I'm almost 30. Are responsible for 3,000 families of their clan, broader clan who live in the Chinese area. And so they, and especially him, spends an enormous amount of time dealing with squabbles and fights and other serious problems among these families. But this gives him great meaning because he wants to be with people and help solve their problems. He decided not to participate in that intifada on the front line, so to say, because he was deprived of his own father in his first 5 years of school and didn't want 5 years of life, and didn't want to ever be put on a blacklist where he would be, his own kids would be deprived of his presence. He was beaten, however, on multiple occasions as a young boy. And so, okay, that's on Khalil, different. Very tall, slim, exceptionally deep voice, commanding authority that he, for much of his life, never thought he deserved. Born to a very poor family in the strip, in the same refugee camp as Haman. Always been devoted to justice and defending people. He was taught this early on by his illiterate mother, who drilled into the kids the values of Islam, and especially the need to care for the poor and the greedy. And he kept that devotion through his life. He wanted to go to graduate school like the others, but was not allowed to leave Gaza, and then was hired at the age of 27, I believe, to be the leader of one of Gaza's human rights organizations. He loved that work. He was outspoken, fearless in criticizing any abuse, not just the Israeli abuses, but of any faction in Gaza or Palestine who were behaving improperly. That got him into a lot of trouble, a lot of arrests, and eventually severe problems later in life when Hamas took after him. He was involved in Intifada. He was in prison and severely treated multiple times. Sam, I call the educator, the scholar of the group. He's quiet, soft-spoken, scholarly, serious, incredibly devoted to achievement, especially in educational realm. He's risen to the role of assistant dean of one of Gaza's colleges, where he has taught progressively for decades. He was very active in Intifada and was imprisoned multiple times and also severely tortured. So a little bit about their wives. Hammam married Shada when he was 25, and Shada was fond to him because he recalled vividly at 5 years old attending her birth. They've had 3 children, and I get myself in trouble here when I say that their marriage is maybe one of the healthiest and best I've ever witnessed their 2 partners. Khalil married Sahar in his late 20s, and like Khalil, Sahar was a very committed human rights activist, which was quite unusual for a woman in those days to be that outspoken up front. They've had 3 kids, Muhammad the eldest, and 2 daughters. And for Hussam married Mai after his graduate degree in the States, and they have raised 5 children, a son and 3 daughters. And Mai herself was highly educated and a professional interpreter, and still works in this capacity. Okay, a little bit about the book itself. I've written a 12-page introduction in which I try to provide some necessary history and geography and about my involvement and about the uniqueness of the book. And then I've divided it into 2 parts. The first part covers the lives of these 3 men and eventually families up until October 2023. And there I narrate the stories and events and periods of time which they themselves nominated as being most reflective of who they are and how they grew and developed. I've not created any scenes. I have, with their permission, embellished a little bit, bringing in some features of culture, which I thought were relevant. They've all read the manuscript, their narratives, and have approved it as authentic and valid and a good representation of who they are. Part 2 begins October 23rd, October 7th, 2023. And we don't need a reminder, perhaps, that on that day, that momentous day, when Hamas attacked southern Israel and killed up to 1,000 people, near 1,000 people, and injured many more, and took 250 plus hostages, 2,000. That same day, Israel started its response, reaction, and that has continued to this very day. And let's be honest, its response now over 16 months meets any definition of genocide. It is not just the 60,000 people killed or the 120,000 injured, but it's the widespread destruction of Gaza that stretched to literally all parts of Gaza that I know have been destroyed. Massive destruction of water and sewage networks, destruction of hospitals, universities, libraries, archives, schools, and of course the continual threat of the displaced that is transferred out of Gaza. So for the characters, all of them suffered mightily, and all of them have been displaced between 5 and 10 times in and around Gaza. All of them have had family members injured or killed. All of them have lived in tents. All of them have scrambled for food and been hungry and suffered illnesses. And so part 2 is literally the collection of their direct messages to me via WhatsApp, starting October 7th, that awful day, and continuing for a full year until October 7th, 2024, just a few months ago. And so here we have, I think, a very unique recording of what it's literally like to live during this onslaught, this genocidal onslaught of their lives. They suffered greatly, and but I want to be sure to point out that in every case, in all of their cases, multiple times, like they described a day, a moment of suffering, they've always said, we're ashamed to talk about our own suffering because so many people in Gaza have it so much worse. You want to know how they're doing? I texted with them today and yesterday. You know, how do you answer that question? It's always difficult. And I can say that they're still alive, that they're uninjured physically, that they've recovered from illnesses they've suffered, but that they are, you know, let's say, they're paralyzed by the uncertainty. It's nice now to have had a month of ceasefire, but that brings clear to their minds as they've been able to return to their homes and see their destruction, about the awful task now of trying to make life work, find funds and materials to rebuild those homes and the like. So Hussein Khalil is still living with his family in a tent, and sometimes the rubble of a poorly constructed building. They hope next week to be able to go back to Gaza City and start rebuilding their apartment if indeed they can find the money and materials. Same for Hussein. He's his dream home that he built just a few years ago was heavily destroyed, and he's looking for time and money and resources to rebuild. He's living in a family home, which I have been interviewed him many times. Yeah, so Haman is living back at his home. It was partially destroyed, and he's been able to put it together in some way where it's livable, but of course the neighborhood has no electricity or water. I want to close now and hope for discussion by reading a few passages from Muhammad, who is Khalil's oldest son, now 24. He wrote these last year, and although I haven't talked to him directly about these sentiments recently, I know him well enough and see his postings to know that he would feel the exactly same way. He writes in January 2024, "Our souls are filled with pain, sorrow, and tears we can no longer shed. Each day brings a new story, a worse reality than the one before. Yet as long as we have breath, the dream endures." 4 months later, in April, he wrote, "Resilience and determination to live with dignity burns within us. And with each passing day, hope is somehow maintained, and the will to move forward grows despite all the hardships." So, Peter, back to you.
Thank you, Brian. So, do any of the 3 men that you've been following, their families, do any of them want to leave Gaza if they could?
You know, that's a really complicated question to answer. They will leave Gaza if it provides opportunity for their children to continue their education. All of the 3 are concerned about is their collective 12 children and providing a life for them. But if leaving Gaza facilitated that, they would do it. Would they leave Gaza otherwise? Well, you know, if life becomes unbearable, which to us it seems already has, they might leave just to save themselves.
Yeah.
But
So it looks like this phase of the ceasefire may be completed. And then we move to phase two, which would be all Israeli soldiers leaving Gaza, and all hostages returned, whether dead or alive. And then there's phase three, which is reconstruction. And you mentioned uncertainty. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty between, Trump saying we're going to turn it into the Riviera, and all Gazans will have to go somewhere else, even though there's no country that will accept them. At least their neighbors, Egypt and Jordan, have both made it very clear they won't accept them. So what do you think is really a plausible future where, clearly Hamas is not being defeated, although it's obviously been damaged very significantly. But we know from the pictures of the release of hostages, Hamas has obviously got an armed presence. And then there are smaller groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Both of those groups would not be presumably welcome to run Gaza by Israel or the United States, possibly even the Arab countries, and possibly even by many Palestinians. So is there a Palestinian Authority, or is there a group of Palestinian technocrats, backed by major Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, that you could imagine might act as a peacekeeping force of some kind, police force that brings some kind of security that's sort of acceptable to all the players?
Well, I actually don't. This is not new, really. And the Palestinian factions have tried to have a unity government ever since Hamas was elected in 2006, and many times since, and they have not been able to come to an agreement of a unified leadership of Palestinians. And so I'm not hopeful that they themselves would be able to agree to that, or that the people themselves would buy in, especially if the PA were to be believed. I mean, the PA, Palestinian Authority, has been brutal to thousands. And you'll read stories in the book about how their slashing of salaries has made life virtually impossible, even before October 2023. I don't know the answer except to go back to the fundamentals and remind that this current crisis, as devilish as it is not the beginning of the problem. It's the fact that these people have lived under a harsh political occupation for over 50 years now, and but peace of mind for Palestinian and peace in their society really can't occur completely until those issues are addressed, until they are given opportunity and respect to live their lives free of political control. So whatever the power brokers here down the street and everywhere else decide, nothing's going to work effectively until that tight control and abuse is reversed.
We have some questions coming in. A question from Brian H. About he asks, when you say okay, what does that mean physically, emotionally, the present state of the families that you've been tracking?
Well, like I said, they're not injured physically, and they have been able to feed themselves. And fortunately, prices of the astronomical price of food during the last 16 months have eased somewhat since more aid has been allowed to be in.
that's an important point, Brian, that we should unpack a bit. So
Yeah.
for the October 7th war, 500 trucks of aid were coming in every day. That number went down to an average of like 30 at one point, or even 50. But I mean, obviously, a drop in the bucket, and that went on for a long time. As a result of the ceasefire, my understanding is that 600 trucks a day of aid are supposed to be going in, and it seems that quite a lot of aid is beginning to flow in. So that is beginning to make a difference.
I believe actually maybe it was yesterday that even 800 trucks were allowed in, but that's quite new for most of this month of the ceasefire. And much fewer aid has been allowed in than was agreed upon. But it has made a big difference. To the degree that Israel will allow more aid to be delivered, it's not at all clear. They're both, positioning themselves for the ceasefire, and so I think kind of our blessings that they've gotten some remedy for the time being, but I have no confidence that will continue.
The other issue, of course, is UNRWA, which has been educating hundreds of thousands of Palestinian kids and has been in the Gaza Strip for many decades, and is really the most effective organization working on behalf of Palestinians, in which the Knesset has sort of basically sort of suggested as a terrorist organization. Now, there's some allegations that UNRWA employees may have been involved in October 7th. The UN has denied that, but that's certainly the Israeli position. There's also allegations that one of the hostages was kept in an UNRWA facility. But be that, leaving aside that question for a minute, I mean, if indeed Israel sort of blocks the ability of UNRWA to do its work in Gaza, what are the alternatives? Obviously, there are some NGOs, but they don't have this kind of capacity that UNRWA has.
Right. It's almost impossible to conceive how things could continue without UNRWA. And in fact, they're still very active in the Strip, in schooling and medical and so forth. I mean, there are other charities and organizations, as you well know, who provide aid, World Food Program, et cetera, and but none of them have the infrastructure that UNRWA has in terms of buildings and schools and hospitals and so forth. So it's not new that Israel wants to get rid of UNRWA. That's not at all a new feature.
Brian, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Because so in the name UNRWA, there's the word refugee. Is Israel's objection to UNRWA kind of a philosophical one on some levels, which is that refugees have the right of return, and that this is a UN agency that's catering to people who are called refugees rather than something else?
Yeah, I'm sure that's in the thinking of the Israelis. I can't pinpoint the complexity of their decision on this, but they've been opposed virulently for decades now in its existence, promoting refugeehood, as they criticized for, but who have been indispensable, literally indispensable to the survival of people in Gaza.
Some other questions coming in. I mean, pull them. So from Anonymous, this is a good question. What do you think is the value of the longitudinal narrative? Which I guess is a fancy way of saying you've been following these same people for 3 decades. What is it? What do you learn that is different than just if you sort of parachute in and spend a couple of weeks with a particular person?
Well, I think clearly it's the richness of the narrative you're able to transfer. In quick snapshots, it can be very dramatic and interesting and revealing. You just get that snapshot, but not not the durability and the view into how people respond, survive, cope, regenerate, and make life work.
Well, also these families must have gotten to know you pretty well over 3 decades. And are you communicating with them in Arabic or English or both, or how are you communicating?
So the formal interviews I've done with them and thousands of others have done in English with translation, interpretation when necessary. My Arabic is not good enough to have complex conversations about personal things. And so Haman, Khalil, and Hassan's English is good enough to mostly for me to do interviews in English. And when I need to, I had their statements translated. Personally, we talk. I try to speak Arabic with them, and they're very kind and letting me do that. But that's in English.
And so October, so it's interesting. Your book is divided into before October 7th and after October 7th. Obviously, you had no idea that October 7th was going to happen, but you were already pretty deep into the book at that point, right?
Right. So the first part of the book was completely written before October 7th, and I've had plenty of difficulty getting this published through traditional channels, and so it was ready to go virtually, and then when October 7th happened, I realized, wow, this is now much more urgent than before, and that's why I went ahead and publishing it by myself, and it also provided this unique insight into the daily lives and their thoughts.
Another question from Anonymous. What's the best way for us to help?
Oh, another one of those difficult questions. I think I'll say first, financial help. Obviously, every single Palestinian is in desperate need of financial help. But really, it's quite difficult now to get funds into Gaza, even if you have direct connections with people.
Can I ask you a question about that, Brian? Because I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and I've found that Western Union, I can transfer money to a family in need in Afghanistan, really without any effort at all, almost. I mean, it's very seamless and easy to do, and also the family can pick up the money without being ripped off by the bank that receives the money. Is that so? Can you send remittances or support to people in Gaza, or is that more or less impossible right now?
It's changed over the months. Early on, it was conceivable to do Western Union and also PayPal, to the degree that people had an account with PayPal. And then there are wire transfers which can be made from bank to bank. And although it destroyed the banking system, is still up and functioning. And so when I send money to Gazans, I'll transfer it to their bank directly. But then the horror starts. I mean, all the branches are not open, so people can't really get necessarily to a bank. And there's been now this system of fees, as Salman calls them, of people who have better access to the bank, and they charge up to 25% of the sum in order to go pick up the cash.
Question from Rami Khoury. Thanks for a fine book. Do you sense differences in political or identity attitudes among the several generations of Gazans you have known?
Yes and no. What has not changed and never will change by my assessment is that Palestinians are committed to liberation, to freedom from the occupation, from needing to have their, wanting to have their lives unregulated and given opportunity to proceed and lead productive lives for themselves and their families. That has never changed, and you hear that in Muhammad's comments here. So that sense of Palestinian nationalism is invariable. People choose different ways to approach that and how to achieve that. In personal stories that I know, there have been some transitions over time. Hussein, for example, was very committed to a particular faction through his teenage years, through the Intifada and a little bit beyond. But then came very offended by some of the revelations of corruption that his leaders had gone through, and he left the faction and was without a guide for the next set of years until circumstances led him to really dive deeper into Islam and become and find meaning in that system. So he's unaffiliated politically. Yeah.
I mean, obviously Hamas won the election in 2006, and then didn't have any elections after that. And public opinion polling in Gaza, I guess, I mean, I don't know how accurate it would be, but I mean, is it a more Islamist than it would have been 20 years ago? Is it more secular than it would have been 20 years ago? Has there been a anti-Hamas backlash in the sense that Hamas sort of carried out this October 7th attack? And really, you know, sure, they've had some Palestinian prisoners who have been released, but otherwise, they're ultimately, you know, the war has destroyed or damaged 70% of the buildings and essentially turned this place into rubble, and Hamas instigated that. So has there been kind of a backlash against Hamas? And is there any really kind of viable alternative?
Right. Critical questions. I happened to have been in Gaza in 2006, the day of the election, and was as surprised as everyone else was with INS's legislative council victory. Then followed the brutal civil war between Fatah and Hamas. And I recall people of being two minds relative to Hamas after they took full control. One was relief and gratitude that they had brought order back to the society, where the conflict had been stopped, literally, and people could go out in the streets and live their lives. But also not happy with the level of regulation that has exercised over civilian life in Gaza. As to current, I mean, it's an unfair question, really, for us to ask of them what they feel. It depends on the moment, and so from day to day, you can get a different perspective. Hamas is honored because it's the only Palestinian group that has been willing to continue the struggle against the occupation. That's the way many view it. Not that they approve of their methods or techniques necessarily, but at least they're defending the utter urgency of becoming a free people. Sure, there are people who on a different day would emphasize the fact that, you know, what good is it brought us and all the suffering, and how dare they bring this on us. But generally speaking, I haven't seen the latest polls either about support. Hamas is never near the majority of support. And I suspect that, again, it all depends on the moment you're asking. And also, shall I say, how willing the interlocutor is free they feel to say their actual views. especially when it's done electronically, media, all thousands and bankers are aware that communications are surveilled and they're not feel free to say exactly what they might be thinking. But just to summarize, I would say, like I said before, the way I know Palestinians, I would say that they are after the simple dream of peace, opportunity, life for their children, and whatever brings that most reliable, they will be favored.
Well, I mean, but that goal seems more distant today than it's been, perhaps. I mean, what's your personal view? I mean, you've been visiting since for 3 decades now. You know, is there any kind of potential resolution in sight?
No, because we can't even see inside the minds of the people who are making these decisions. Obviously, Palestinians in Gaza, West Bank, aren't able to, from one day to the next, make some kind of miracle political change and life becomes better. I don't see anything that indicates that Israel or the United States has any real interest in honoring the well-being of the Palestinians in either territory. And as we know, there's continued discussion of stubbing in some degree. So no, I wish I could say something positive.
Yeah, and it also seems that the peace kind of camp in Israel has more or less collapsed, in the sense that the kind of constituency that obviously was pretty vibrant for a long time in Israel on the left to make some kind of deal, that seems to have more or less evaporated. Is that correct?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I think that's one of the consequences of October 7th. Although, to be clear, the Israel left has never been fully in support of equality for Palestinians. Under the liberal Labour governments, more settlements were built, for example, than under the coup. So liberal needs to be understood carefully.
From Anonymous, your book is quite remarkable and hope it's widely read. How is it being distributed? In addition, as Emily from New America Events points out, your website is www.bkbarber.com, but it's also on Amazon, right?
Right. So I chose to self-publish via Amazon, which means obviously it's available on Amazon, but also many other places. Barnes and Noble, Amazon shares distribution with other sites, so Ingram Spark, Barnes and Noble, books, etc. It's available there.
What are the strengths of the Palestinian people that you have met over your long-term reporting there? That's another question from Anonymous.
Well, I think, like I started the conversation, the strengths are dedication, determination. Often people are surprised to hear that the literacy rate in Palestine, including Gaza, is always over 95%. So one of the highest in the world. These are competent, ambitious people who are committed utterly in ways that none of us, I think, can understand to the cause of being free and to their little bit of land as being to call it their home. So dedication, intelligence, commitment, and genuine care for good things in life, like the well-being of their families. And as I said, these three characters of mine are utterly and only concerned about what will making a future for their children.
It does seem that Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, you know, either, I mean, he has, I think, if you go back to October 6, 2023, Israel and Saudi Arabia, I think, were close to recognizing each other. Israeli cabinet officials had traveled to Saudi Arabia. An Israeli official actually performed some kind of Jewish ceremony in a hotel room in Riyadh and put it on social media. And I think Mohammed bin Salman himself, who's obviously put the Wahhabi kind of police back in their barracks and has kind of secularized to some degree Saudi society. But at the same time, he may personally want to do a deal with Israel, but I think it would be politically very, very, very hard for him, even though he runs an absolute monarchy, to ignore the wishes of his own people who do actually really want a Palestinian state. And he's been quite explicit about the necessity of a Palestinian state. So, and clearly, the Trump administration would like to make that happen, where would be the kind of the Abraham Accords sort of basically, the final act of the Abraham Accords would be the Israeli recognition of Saudi Arabia and vice versa. But, I mean, that seems like a very distant proposition now, even if the Saudis, are pretty insistent that that's, a sine qua non of their recognition.
Right. I mean, I think it's careful. It's important to point out that the Saudi endorsement of a Palestinian state, or those similar endorsements by other countries, Arab countries, can be very empty. Frankly, if I recall correctly, the Saudi demand was that there be a progress towards a Palestinian state, which is what we heard in 1994 with the Oslo Accord. Okay, there'll be progress, and then it's stepwise, and each step is designed so that it can fail itself or be sabotaged. And so I'm not personally confident that the Saudis really care about having a viable Palestinian state.
Yeah. From Sandy, how has this work changed you as a scholar and as a human?
So pretty easy to answer. As a scholar, it changed me from my training, which was to do a large-scale survey research, getting lots of information, pretty thin information, but being able to make broad conclusions, to a person a scholar who needed to listen much more than before, and turned me into a quasi-anthropologist or cultural psychologist, where I believe that information and learning comes from associating with the people you're trying to understand, and going from there. As a person, I'm a much better person because of my association with these families and the thousands of others I know. I've seen what it's like on the ground, to what injustice and humiliation really feel like on the ground. And so I think I always was kind of a humble guy, ever more so, and I've learned to really value and appreciate people for their own work.
You mentioned that you've shown the drafts of the books to the three main characters, and so how do they receive it? I mean, do they make suggestions about how you could improve things, or do they just say this is okay, or what do they? I mean, they think it's a realistic, fair account of what, and they don't you kind of give it to them as a courtesy, so they're not surprised, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, of course, the natural Palestinian response would be to praise it up and down. Of course, it's great. But these guys also have their own pride, and they were very careful in making sure that I had described faithfully their experiences, and they would, all three of them, at various points, would say, no, actually, you didn't get that quite right, either on a detail or on the meaning of the moment. But generally speaking, I'm deeply moved by the comments they've written me about how valid and valuable it is, and how honored they feel that the world now gets to hear their story.
Because I presume there's sensitivities both about politics. Obviously, it's a very politicized environment, and there are also social sensitivities about, you've talked about their wives and their kids, and Arab society can be sometimes, very private about family issues. So how do you navigate those in the book? And I mean, was that a problem, either one of those, or was that a sort of a non-issue?
I'd say non-issue, except, and I'm glad for the reminder to say that these three characters are all men, and that and there's meaning behind that. I mean, in past Gazan culture, Palestinian culture, including up to today, one just cannot, as a foreign male, intrude into the life of females as necessary to get nuance and challenge contradictions and so forth. Like I could never walk down the alleyway of a camp just chatting with a female. I couldn't be alone with a female at a coffee shop. So this is just the nature of the culture. And so I don't have the in-depth information on females that one might look for. That said, though, I think it was the durability of my presence that made them trust me, and open really up their lives to me in ways that many foreigners never get. And which included then discussions and interviews with wives and mothers in the presence of other people. Beyond that gender issue, I have the sense that while imagining a foreigner like me can never get deeply inside that culture, that because of the long-term presence of mine, I was able to get as deep as one could get.
Well, on that note, Brian, good luck with the book, and thank you for doing this event. I want to thank the audience for tuning in, and if you want to buy the book, you can do it at www.bkbarber.com or on Amazon. Thank you, Brian, and good luck with the rest of the discussions that you have around the book.
Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate it.
Thank you.